that this is more important in some ways than 1776. And I'm curious to hear you talk through how you think about it.
Yes, so that language was written that way on purpose. And what we are really arguing is that so much of what makes America unique in ways good and bad, right? The societal tensions, the kind of our greatest divides, our polarization, but also our culture, our language, our music, our cuisine, again, democracy itself, that so much of that begins with that decision in 1619 to engage in African slavery. And so it's really saying, how could we better understand our country if we considered 1619 as an origin point?
Hi, I'm Kendall Qualls, and this is Fully Charged. On this podcast, we counter the progressive narrative that we hear in the public and give you a perspective that you rarely hear conveyed in the public arena. Today on our podcast, we have Wilfred Reilly. He's a university professor and an attorney. He's our guest today as we discuss timely and hot topics of the day. Wilfred, thank you for joining us.
Glad to be on with you guys.
We recently had Nicole Hannah-Jones here visit the University of Minnesota. She was speaking on the topic of 1619 Project. You know, that's her thing. She actually got a Pulitzer for that, surprisingly. And, I got a chance to watch your PragerU video on this very topic. And so give me your idea about all of the attention she's getting around this, even though historians have dubbed it illegitimate, if you will. But she's still getting a lot of press, a lot of attention. She got $50,000 for her talk coming here to the university. And speak to that real quick, if you would.
Well, I do think it's funny that a lot of very well-known Marxists don't seem to be doing too badly financially. I mean, I don't know how he identifies politically, but the brother Ibram Kendi, I know, is also in that $40,000 to $50,000 range. Robin DiAngelo, again, a similar price tag. So that is entertaining. I didn't know Ms. Hannah-Jones had crossed the $50,000 mark. But yeah, I mean, I think the 1619 Project is interesting because it's almost perfectly designed to appeal to kind of a certain kind of guilty white liberal. And the idea is that almost everything in American society, American history, comes out of antebellum black slavery. But as great as the contributions of our people historically have been, it's almost a nonsensical claim. I mean, one of 1619's early arguments was that the Revolutionary War was fought, in fact, to preserve slavery. The British wanted to immediately end territorial slavery in the USA, and that is completely untrue. The British Empire didn't end slavery in overseas territories like the USA until, I believe, 1833. And there are a large number of other comments like that. Slavery or racism is in America's DNA, which would make it unchangeable, unremovable. Very specific arguments in the 1619 Project as well, that a number of things about American life, the unhealthy nature of our diet, the congestion of traffic in the North, come out of a past history of racial conflict that have been pretty vigorously attacked by most historians. I mean, there are entire books with names like, 1620, exposing the errors of the 1619 Project. So I think as a work of factual history, 1619 is extremely badly flawed. And I think that in fact is the consensus. That's not myself talking as an academic on sort of the center right. I think as a work of kind of public advocacy, though, it's been very popular and apparently very profitable from what you just told me at the start there.
You know what's interesting? You made a comment about, center right, center left, all that. I started my life in dire poverty, and all I did was follow the formula of America: work hard, get a good education. I got married and then had children, and then I went into the private sector. And then what I found is that the private sector, you could compete for jobs, your ability to line up in sales and marketing. And I wind up having a very successful career. That didn't used to be center right or conservative. That was American.
Well, I think there are two things there. So yeah, when I was in high school, an athletic coach set a bunch of us down, and after the usual shouting and so on, said, I really do care about you guys, and there are four things I want you to keep in mind that if you do, you're going to be pretty successful in life. One was wait until you're married or you're at least 25 to have kids. One was don't get convicted of a felony, and there was some joking and some laughter after that, but it's very true. One was take a job, any job, and work it until you get a better job. And the last was graduate from high school, get the degree, and beyond that, a diploma. And I later learned that that's called the success sequence. I mean, this guy wasn't speaking in fancy social science terms by any means, like Coach Panka. But if you do those things, your chance of being poor as a male, as white or African American, a Latino, is 0.7%. It's less than 1%. This is a real fact that we know. So, I mean, I agree with you that is just reality, and that reality is true for almost all people. And yeah, I think that that's one of the big points of my writing. That very often when we look at sectors like education, there are all these complex theories about what we need to do. We need more money, or we need to introduce this or that sort of Marxist theory of behavior. 1619 has a curriculum for the high schools. The Zen Education Project, which frankly is Marxist, has a curriculum for the high schools. And pretty often, if you just teach people how to read and write and do math, and you keep the kids in school for long hours every day, they're going to do fine. So often, yeah, I, as a social scientist, am focused on kind of the non-flashy, unromantic, sort of actual ideas that will help the primarily Black and Appalachian kids I teach, actually, at Kentucky State succeed. Yeah, I don't necessarily think that's conservative or liberal. I do think it's become associated with the right. Like I said, I'm a businessman like you, or I put myself on kind of the center right. I'm pretty strongly in favor of private firearm ownership. I like to keep those taxes low. I'm pretty traditionalist when it comes to relationships, that sort of thing. But I mean, I think a lot of this has become associated with conservatism because we've seen the rise of another movement in the USA in the recent past, which some people call the woke movement or the critical movement, but which argues that the problem in the USA is almost entirely sort of external prejudice. So we recently saw the KIPP chain of charter schools, which does just a great job, in my opinion. But they changed their slogan from what it originally was, which is, if I recall, work hard, be nice, compete, because they thought that work hard, be nice, compete didn't reflect the realities of quote unquote systemic racism. So there's a counterpart to what you and I and almost everyone else were taught back in the day, which is that you can make your life kind of what you want it to be. And that is that there are these external forces, primarily racism, that are pressing down upon you. And that other than culture, beyond almost anything, is the primary driver. So in opposing that, you often find yourself forced into one of the two political camps.
Well, at the end of the day, what I often say is that when I say they, I'm talking about the socialists, those people, especially even those people in the Black community, and many of them are pastors in our communities. They are fronting for the failures of this social system, the social welfare system that they got our communities hooked on back in the 60s and 70s, and the biggest disparity are those programs and the people who succumb to those programs, and they have no way of hiding it. They have no way of justifying or saying, look at the great outcomes. So they do this reverse racism issue. Those aren't racial problems. Those are fatherless home problems, and they never, ever confront those programs and what they've done to the Black community.
Yeah, well, the actual Ibram Kendi or Nicole Hannah-Jones argument is a very skillful Kafka trap is the term, because what they essentially say is that when you see any problem in, for example, the Black community, you're seeing racism. So what Dr. Kendi will do is create this sort of kind of unnatural dichotomy where he'll say, if you see an issue like fatherlessness, there are two possible explanations if fatherlessness is greater in the Black community than in the white community. One is inferiority, and he'll directly use that term. There's something wrong at a deep-seated, I think he means genetic level. That's option one. And option two is that there's this very subtle racism that exists somewhere in the system that's causing this. So what people on the other side, what I would consider the socialist side, race Marxist side, will try to do is invariably flip everything back into this discussion about racism, which is the one variable that they recognize. The problem with this, though, there are really two of them. One, Asian Americans or Nigerian Americans have much less of a problem with fatherlessness than whites do. Right? So you can't just say, well, the reason for that, Jewish Americans, you can't just say the reason for that is that society is prejudiced for Asians and Jews and West Africans and against white people. The second is that Black Americans used to, quote unquote, have our own. We used to have a thriving Black business community, an extraordinarily low rate of fatherlessness. I mean, in 1948, when the great Walter Williams looked at this, I mean, the rate of fatherlessness in the Black community was, forgive me if I misquote the gentleman, but I think 9%, 10%. Whites are doing even better, 4%. So good job, countrymen. But it was literally a race down to zero. This wasn't a problem. So you can't argue that there was less racism in 1945 than there is in 2023. It just doesn't make sense. So when you actually start unpacking this, you find that a whole bunch of things are being shoved aside to get to that racism versus inferiority dichotomy. I mean, you're completely ignoring the welfare revolution of the 1960s, for example, which is what actually caused this.
And what's so ironic is that we have a state that was that fought in the Civil War on the side of the Union to end slavery, and we weren't a slave state, but we have a mayor here that wants to look at reparations for its citizens. So speak to that for me.
Well, I think, so first of all, reparations, now this might surprise you. Reparations is not something I view as inherently evil. I mean, the great General Sherman proposed reparations 150 plus years ago. The problem, of course, the difference between now and then is at that point there were slaves. I mean, there were people who had been abused by the Confederacy and that had often fought by his side and so on that he wanted to compensate. Today, I don't think it's going to work. The actual praxis is probably unfeasible. There are three major problems. One is who gets. Are you going to DNA test people? I mean, looking at me, I'm pretty light skinned. I'm about 40% Black. I'm part Native American. I'm part Irish. That's another group that's really suffered in this country. And I'm part African American. So are the Irishmen and the natives in my family tree not going to get paid for their time in the fields? But the African Americans are. I mean, I see this causing some tensions. Yeah. So that's one thing. And I'm not even kidding here. I mean, this is
you get 40%.
Yeah, 40. That's right. I get half of a check. You know, which direction is the check cut? That's the question. But I mean, another is who gives. So this, and I think this is the real question. I mean, they're talking about reparations in California. I mean, California is a state that, without even bantering now, must be more than 40% Latino. Hardworking community, come here mostly through legal immigration, and I mean, in many cases, experience as much racism as African Americans, lower incomes than African Americans and whites. Are those guys going to have to pay for their Black countrymen's reparations payments? I mean, and a third, and this goes on and on. Will the descendants of Union soldiers have to pay reparations? I mean, we actually have, organizations with names like Sons of the Union, Sons of the Confederacy. We know exactly who those people are. Are they going to have to pay despite their ancestors' heroic service? And I think finally a third would be who's next. So I mentioned Native Americans. I mentioned Irishmen. The United States has a long and bloody history. So if we pay out $1 trillion to one of the large groups in our population, I can guarantee you, I've worked with some of the Indian tribes here in our Commonwealth of Kentucky. I can guarantee you there's going to be a lengthy lineup of populations, Native Alaskans, Hawaiians, that are going to be next with the hat extended. So I don't think this is a good idea. I don't think this is something that's necessary. I don't think it's something that's going to happen. I do think it's going to be a popular stump issue for the next 10 years. And I think that opposition to it is going to be one of the things that's used to castigate people as racists and bigots and so on down the line, of course.
Tell us about the book that you currently have on the market and the audience, where they can find it and the title and all that.
Yeah, well, the next book that I have coming out is called Lies Your Liberal Teacher Told You. Most of my books have these, my popular press books have sort of provocative titles. You know, you recognize them at the bookstore. But this is a pretty serious social science book, as Hate Crime Hoax was, by the way. In the early 1990s, a pretty famous book was released called Lies My Teacher Told Me. And the focus of that book was criticizing kind of the jingoistic education that you probably would have gotten as a white kid in the US Midwest in the 60s or 70s. So they talk about some of the things that, I mean, they mentioned, for example, that there were many Native Americans in the USA and some of them were highly civilized, for example. I mean, at the time, that might have been a little groundbreaking. And what I do, and that's a useful book, and I've read that book, so I don't necessarily hate on other social scientists from across the aisle. But what I do in my book is make the point, look, for the last 30, 35 years, right, we've been hearing the other narrative. In college and even in secondary education, the people that are writing from the left have taken over. So I criticize some of these things that you now hear from that perspective, from the 1619 Howard Zinn, so on perspective, that are false. So, for example, one of my chapters is Native Americans weren't peaceful. And I go through some of these lessons that you get from the federal government about, you know, never a grain of corn was harmed, you know, the in perfect harmony with nature, and actually describe, you know, the Aztec way of life, for example, without giving too much away. In the more recent past, I talk about, for example, the whole idea of the Red Scare, where you have these movies like Trumbo, where the hero is a noble communist. And the idea is that the government was harassing artists and film producers for no reason. They were coming after them. It was like Hitler's Germany. And I make the point, no. In political science, we have a series of documents known as the Venona Cables that were declassified after the Cold War ended in the early 1990s. And we now know that almost all those people, Alger Hiss and so on, that were accused of being Russian agents in the 1950s were actually Russian spies. The government was infested with Russian spies. I mean, they were in the top councils of the USA. It's lucky we survived. So, I mean, to some extent, McCarthy and those people that were pointing this out were right. And really, ever since that point, we've had people calling out high-level threats to the USA. To some extent, we see this now with the CRT or some of the things that are being done to kids. And those people have been described as lunatics, the radical fringe, and very often they've simply been correct. So I make that point. I draw the connections with today. And there are other sort of drier chapters. I talk about slavery historically. The USA didn't stand alone in having slaves. I talk about some of the great black slaving states, talk about the Mongol Empire. So I kind of shout out the history of man for a chapter, the great warrior kings of every people. But it's sort of a politically incorrect guide to the history of the world, but with a focus on the USA.
Well, I think I'll be the first one to read it, to be honest with you, because what's happening in our cultures, our kids, they assume that slavery only happened in the United States. They have no idea of what the world dynamic of that issue. They're coming out of schools literally, you know, apathetic about their country, and some even borderline hating their country. If that were to happen in any other country, they would lock these people up. I talk about teachers, administrators. Other countries, they would lock them up as treasonous.
I think it's actually literally true in the rising minority powers. And, you know, as a black man, I applaud their rise as long as they don't rise too close to us. But China, Nigeria, India, if you came out and said, you know, the first emperor was nothing but a slave mastering abusive. Yes. I mean, it is quite literally possible that you would suffer a legal penalty for doing that. We in the USA, and to a lesser extent in Western Europe, seem to have a penchant, a taste for intense self-criticism and abuse. I don't know why that is. It might come out of that European critical tradition that goes back to Socrates. But I do, perhaps because of my own somewhat non-European roots, think it often can go to crazy extremes. But yeah, this is your basic point, though, that the average American would think that slavery existed only here, or at most only in a few other Western white countries. That is statistically true. There are studies in political science demonstrating that. So when people think of the slave trade, they think almost entirely of what is properly known as the Atlantic slave trade, which was Western enslavement of black Africans. they don't think of, for example, the Barbary slave trade, which was the civilized Muslim and black African states enslaving whites. It's not like they always lost the wars. I mean, there was a substantial North African slave trade in captured Caucasian sailors and so on. It's a smaller trade. We don't need to compare them exactly, but that's the reason for the line "Shores of Tripoli" being in the Marine Corps hymn in the United States. The United States at one point sent an armada of warships to the Barbary states, the Moorish pirate kingdoms, to get some of our captured warriors back. And there was a battle, hundreds lost on both sides.
With that, let me give you perspective. You know what? I've never been involved in nonprofits or in politics. I lived my life, as I mentioned before, and the notion of what's been going on in our country, I felt obligated to stand up and do something. Call it my Christian faith, call it my time in service in the military, that I felt, man, what's happening is our country's at risk. And I don't believe people understand the severity of what's really going on. So we started this organization, Take Charge, and it's the notion is very simple, that the promise of America works for everyone, regardless of race, and or regardless of social standing. And in my case, that was both of those issues. And we try to weave out the clutter and just get back to the basics of, look, if you do these things, it'll work for you. And we're recruiting people from the Black community that our message is resonating in a very strong way. What are your thoughts on how this is going to prevail? Because I'm convinced either one of these beliefs, the beliefs in our country, or this new phenomenon that's coming forward, one of those are going to prevail. The two cannot coexist.
But I do think that our philosophy has the advantage of basically being true. I mean, the thing about the success sequence, one of the things that I do think, liberals talk a lot about systems. And I think that, or leftists, let's say, liberals, some guy who's a steel worker who's teaching his son to play baseball isn't the problem here. Leftists talk a lot about systems. But one thing that they neglect is that if you teach a lot of people to make individual change, then you've made systemic change. The basic reality that there are almost as many jobs as there are people in the United States. So we don't really need to have an underclass. But if we do that, given the number of jobs we have, there's really no underclass at all that need exist. The underclass is a welfare system creation. So if you teach people those basics, get a job, get out of high school, don't have kids you can't support, don't commit felony crimes, almost everyone in this society, unlike, for example, scratch and burn agricultural society, can have a productive, reasonably happy role. So I think that we can teach people to do that using what we're talking about, and that is victory, that is success. So I think that's possible for the people that are advocating what we're saying. I don't think that truth-based victory is really possible for the other side. And I actually think this is very important. So like when you look at what Dr. Kendi, for example, or Ms. Hannah-Jones, who I've been quoting, when they say, well, the reason for Black underperformance relative to whites in certain fields, obviously we're doing quite well in athletics, the arts, the soft sciences, but is racism, the problem is that it's not. If it were, we wouldn't be doing very well in athletics and the arts, the soft sciences. Asians wouldn't be beating whites, so on down the line. So if you keep targeting this tiny percentage of racism that still exists between the average middle-class white guy and the average middle-class black guy, you're not really going to accomplish much of anything. I mean, I think if anything, you're just going to worsen racial tensions. So I would say that if they continue doing that and we continue moving people forward, maybe changing the voting registration of some brothers, but more importantly, getting more people trained to do the things that society requires, that's going to be a substantial advantage for us. Other than sort of cheating, I mean, for example, establishing some kind of government program that would mandate what they want to do. I think if you look at, for example, the transgender movement, that's very specifically the goal. The goal is a law that says you can't disagree with me. But unless that happens, I think that the ideas we are propounding will be much more popular with most people than the ideas they are propounding.
Agreed. So you're visiting Minnesota next month. You're coming to Providence Academy. Can you share with the audience about that trip? What do you plan on speaking about? Sure.
Yeah. So I frequently, and by the way, I will say, as you said about yourself, I'm a former, indeed current businessman. I travel pretty often. If you pay me a reasonable fee, or if we have some prior connection through athletics, the arts, perhaps the church, I will come talk to you. So I am going to Providence Academy. It sounds like a very pleasant trip. It's called Pancakes at Providence. Generally, when I do one of these, I don't just like to give a speech and leave. So I usually spend the day. I'm going to show up, do a breakfast, tour the campus, give a talk. People from the community are more than welcome to show up and hear the talk. I think we have an open auditorium for it. And the topic, I think, generally I write up the speech. I like to do an original speech. I write up the speech about a week beforehand. But I think the topic is going to be distinguishing reality from nonsense, sort of. A lot of the things you hear in society. I mean, there are a couple that I would probably hit on. The claim that there are thousands of unarmed black men being killed annually by the police. The claim that there's a wave of epidemic interracial crime. A number of the things I've talked about before, but in more depth. A lot of the things you hear in society all of the time just aren't true. They're crazily false. How can you figure out the truth? So I think that's a useful skill to have for a high school or college student. But the speech itself is usually 20 to 25 minutes. And then I'll allow a pretty long period of time for questions, where if you disagree with me, you can come to the front of the line and, throw a few at me. So I look forward to seeing what the crowd says.
Oh, that's great. Well, we're looking forward to having you, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me on.
Thanks for watching Fully Charged. We created this podcast to counter the progressive narrative and give you the other side of the story that you rarely ever hear. If you like this podcast and believe in what you are doing, hey, please consider subscribing and giving us a 5-star rating. Most importantly, share this podcast with family and friends. To find out more about our work, go to our website at takechargemn.com and please consider supporting us. Your support helps us spread the message, and we'll be back soon with more of a perspective you never hear.